Hello, my name is Eli Seidel, also known as Eli. I'm doing my presentation on the relation between salmon and the First Nations of Vancouver Island. I'll be discussing kind of the physiology of salmon, some of the legends associated with salmon, and the rituals and practices that are associated with them. I'll talk about smoked salmon for a little bit. I'm going to talk about the treaty that's being pushed through right now. Recently was upheld in court up in Canada. I'm going to be talking about some of the problems that salmon faced in the past and will continue to face in the future. And yeah, it's going to be everything. So salmon are very essential to the people of Vancouver Island, First Nations. They are pretty much a staple of their diet, and a lot of their culture revolves around following the salmon and salmon rituals, salmon practices, etc. They're seen as a symbol of regeneration, self-sacrifice, and perseverance. And there is a saying among the people of the Nuchalneth. I have no idea how to say it, unfortunately, but it means to keep some and not to take all. And this embodies a spirit of conservation that is often employed in regards to salmon. We're just kind of, these days, thinking of sustainability and conservation as something new, but this has been essential to their survival as a people for millennia. And salmon were kind of the centerpiece of that conservational spirit. So the split between the Pacific and Atlantic salmon occurred back in the Miocene era. It was about 6 million years ago. They're an anadromous species. That means they'll start off in the freshwater, they'll go back out into the saltwater, and then they'll go back up to freshwater. The split between the Pacific and Atlantic salmon is kind of important because Pacific salmon, they'll be all along the North American coast. They go up to the coast of Russia, and then they go down to the Japan area, which in Japan actually have an entirely different species of salmon up there, along with the ones that we see here. Atlantic salmon are not always anadromous. So the original legend that was associated with the salmon was that the creator was preparing to bring forth the people, humans, onto the earth, and he gathered up all the different creatures and asked who would be willing to sacrifice certain gifts or even themselves in order to help the people sustain themselves and survive. And the first one to come forward was the salmon, who said he would offer his body up to feed the people. And then salmon said he would be the home, water said that he would be the home to the salmon. So that relationship between the salmon and the water and the Nuchalneth is very important. And there is a belief among the West Coast tribes that the salmon people, they're actual people, that they'll go back to the ocean and become people again, and they have a whole underwater city that they'll live in. There is a legend among the West Coast tribes, the Nuchalneth, that there was a boy who he was wasting the salmon and he wasn't treating it properly. And one day he fell into the river when the salmon were returning to the ocean, and he became a salmon, and the salmon people took him back to their city, and they taught him the proper way to maintain the salmon and the proper way to treat it and how to be conservative with the salmon so that it would last for generations to come. The following year, he swam back up the river, and his mother found him because he had the necklace that he had been wearing when he fell into the river, and she helped him become a human again. He became a healer, and he taught the people the proper way to maintain salmon populations and the proper rituals to observe when capturing salmon. And those have been passed on for generations. So back in the day when salmon populations in the area were still doing well, there was one almost every month. The sockeye, they would start in May and June. Then the spring salmon would come in June to August, so that would be pretty much all summer. And then the final run would be the chum salmon, who would be from October to December. And the tribes would go to the different rivers that these different species of salmon would run up. And they would place the weirs in there and capture the salmon that they needed. And that would be the staple of their diet for most of the year and the winter. So these weirs that they would use are essentially fences that they will put in the water. And the salmon are so intent on migrating up these rivers that they'll just sit there and wait. They won't do anything. They'll come to these fences and they'll just sit there and wait and be like, okay, we're just going to chill. And what they do is they'll go in there, they'll get the spears, they'll get nets, and they'll only take a few. They won't have a crazy heyday when they take a whole bunch like you and me might do. They'll only take a few, and then they'll let the rest out through the weir. And then they'll move on to the next weir and take a few from there. And that way, the salmon population is maintained for generations to come. So the ritual that they would have when they would capture the first salmon, it would be called the Big Chief King Salmon. And that salmon, a little bit would be given to everybody in the tribe. Everybody have a little bit of that one salmon. And then they would return the bones to the river so that it would ensure the continuation of salmon, that they would come back every year. There is also usually a lot of dances associated with this, or might be a potluck or two. It was a very big, important time, the first salmon of the year. Smoked salmon, everybody's favorite staple up here in the Pacific Northwest. It would be smoked over cedars, and this would help preserve the meat so that they would have it for not only the summer, but also the winter, because as I said, it was their primary food source. It was important that they kept around for as long as possible. I know you can see here, they have it all held up over the fire, getting it nice and cooked up. So if they stored it properly and they smoked it properly, it could actually last them quite a while. So we began to see very steep drops in the salmon populations around 1950s and 1960s. Up and down the West Coast, the salmon populations fell to like a tenth of what they used to be. It was a very drastic drop. And most of it was because they were logging the areas that the salmon are in. They would remove the woody debris from the water, which they need in order to shelter their eggs. There was, of course, problems with dams being placed in the rivers. They were migrating up and down. And water pollution, of course, is always an issue. Tofino, Canada, there's only 1% of the salmon population that used to be. There's only 1% remaining. And they had problems with the fish farms depleting the stock from the tribal Nuchalnis areas. But as was discussed when we were up there, a lot of those families are dependent upon those fish farms. So it's still an issue that hasn't quite been sorted out yet, unfortunately. So the treaty that's recently been upheld, it states that if the highest domestic court that considers a litigation determines that one or more of the plaintiffs has an aboriginal right to fish for salmon, halibut, rockfish, roe, herring, sablefish, prawn, or crab, and to sell the fish caught under that right on a commercial basis, upon the written request of the Nuchalnis First Nations, provided in 8 years of such determination, the parties will amend this agreement and harvest agreement as described in the harvest agreement. So a lot of fancy words there. Basically what it means is that they have not had the right to commercially fish for these fish species, and they are now being granted that right, which will help them financially quite a bit. So this is basically the results of the treaty, the kind of 5 results. The 5 nations of Nuchalnis, they now have the right to fish and sell, or any of the fish that they want to. Sorry, kind of had to bring her. Yeah, basically, that's the gist of it. They can now sell the fish. They can commercially fish. They have every right to the fish that they had back when they were no white people around in that area. So that's going to help them financially quite a bit, especially considering how the fish farms are depleting their local stock. And now they'll be able to not only fish for the ones in their fishery, they'll be able to go out and fish for like wild salmon and such. So now that they have all these rights to their fisheries, the 5 problems they're going to be facing, often the 5 biggest problems that are facing salmon are broken down into 5 H's, which is harvest, hydropower, habitat, hatcheries, and history. Harvest, of course, is going out there and maybe overfishing. Hydropower are the dams that are being placed within our rivers. Habitat is, as I was saying, the logging and any pollution going into the rivers. The hatcheries, the biggest problems there is that the fish are becoming genetically less diverse, and they're not as strong and capable of surviving in the wild as they used to be. And another one, as discussed by David Montgomery, who wrote King of Fish, the Salmon, he discusses history, which when you look at the history of salmon, you'll see that in England and Ireland and that area, there actually used to be quite a bit of salmon in that area, but they made all these changes to the environment, the salmon disappeared, and then they came here to the East Coast, where there also used to be the Atlantic salmon, and they did the same thing there, and they're losing all the salmon, and now they're in the West Coast, and we're seeing the same problems again. And you would think we would have learned from before, but basically it's history repeating itself over and over again. And the only true way we can learn how to conserve salmon is to look at the past and actually figure out what were wrong with the policies and our behavior before. So all of those are things that the Nuchalnis will have to consider now that they have all these new fishing rights, and when they're trying to reestablish the salmon population within their fishery. So in conclusion, this fishing is very important to Nujales. It's stapled their diet back in the day, and now it can become a very viable economic source for them if they will take care of the fisheries correctly. The elders of the tribe, they're trying to install that sense of conservation and sustainability within the younger generation so that it'll be carried on, and that the salmon populations will be continued to be maintained as they were back in the past. It's important that the younger generation knows about these sort of things because they're the ones that are going to be trying to rebuild the fisheries in the future, especially now that they have commercial fishing rights. And, yeah, that's pretty much everything. So